Okay, so here's something that's going to mess with you a little. You've probably seen those videos. Ancient people were disgusting. They never washed their hands. Great hook, right? Super shareable. One problem, though. It's just not true. Like, at all. Ancient Romans washed their hands before every single meal. It was so normal, so expected, that nobody even talked about it. The same way nobody today says, hey, good job buckling your seatbelt. The Egyptians had actual soap made from animal fat and plant ash, and they used it regularly. Islamic tradition built ritual hand washing into religious law over 1,400 years ago, making it one of the most consistent hygiene habits in all of human history. Jewish law required hand washing at specific points throughout the day, and they even had dedicated blessing formulas for it. So yeah, ancient people washed their hands. A lot, actually. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and honestly, kind of mind-blowing. They were washing their hands constantly, for completely wrong reasons. And in doing so, they accidentally prevented the spread of some of the deadliest diseases in history, without knowing it, for thousands of years. That's the real story. Let's get into it. So what did ancient people actually think they were doing when they washed up? Here's the thing. The idea that invisible particles from a sick person could jump to your hands, transfer to your mouth, and make you seriously ill, that's not an obvious conclusion. That's actually a pretty wild idea when you think about it. And without a microscope, without any way to see bacteria or viruses, working that out was basically impossible. So instead, for most of human history, people had a different explanation for why people got sick. It was called miasma theory. And the basic idea was this: bad air, specifically the gross smells coming off rotting stuff, sewage, sick people, swamps, that bad air was what made you sick. And honestly, for a wrong theory, it held up surprisingly well. Disease was more common near swamps. It was worse in crowded, smelly, unsanitary environments. The pattern matched. The mechanism was completely off, but the predictions were often right, which is actually a fascinating thing about science. A theory can be useful and predictive while still being fundamentally wrong about why something works. Under miasma theory, washing made sense because it removed bad smells. Bad smells meant bad air. Bad air meant disease. So washing was connected to health, just through a totally different chain of logic than we'd use today. It was about atmosphere, not contact. About smell, not germs. Nobody was thinking, I need to wash my hands or I'll transfer bacteria to my food. They were thinking about ritual, about social expectations, about being clean in a spiritual sense. And yet, the result was the same. Let's talk about ritual purity, because this is one of the most underrated parts of this whole story. Almost every major religious tradition has some version of ritual washing, and the specifics matter here. Jewish law, the concept of ritual impurity, or tuma, required hand washing after using the bathroom, before eating, after touching certain things. Islamic tradition has wudu, ritual ablution before prayer. Wash your hands, your face, your feet. Hindu bathing traditions before religious observance created consistent hygiene habits that spanned centuries. Buddhist monastery codes were so detailed about hand washing that historians have actually pointed to them as a reason why monks had lower rates of certain diseases. None of these people were thinking, this is how I prevent fecal-oral transmission of gastrointestinal pathogens. They were doing it because their faith required it, because it maintained a state of spiritual readiness. But here's the wild part. The bacteria didn't care about the reason. The germs were getting washed off either way. The outcome was identical whether you were thinking about God or germs. This is one of the most fascinating patterns in the entire history of medicine. A practice that worked came thousands of years before anyone understood why it worked. And when the understanding finally arrived, it didn't even make the practice more effective. It just changed the justification. Quick detour. Let's talk about soap, because its history is way older than most people realize. The oldest known soap recipe is on a Babylonian clay tablet. We're talking around 2800 BCE. It describes water, alkali, and cassia oil, which is functionally soap. Though interestingly, it was used for washing wool in textile production, not necessarily for people. The Egyptians had similar fat and ash preparations by around 1550 BCE. Romans developed real soap making and used it extensively. By the medieval period, Soap was being commercially manufactured and traded across regions. Castile soap from Spain, Aleppo soap from Syria. Now here's the chemistry that nobody knew about until the 20th century. Soap molecules have two ends. One end is attracted to water. The other end is attracted to fat. When you wash with soap, those fat-loving ends attach to the outer layer of bacteria and viruses, which are coated in a lipid or fat envelope, and the water-loving ends allow the whole thing to rinse away. Soap was literally destroying pathogens for thousands of years, and nobody had any idea. Okay, now we get to the moment where this whole story gets a little heartbreaking. 1840s, Vienna General Hospital. A doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis notices something really disturbing. The hospital has two maternity wards. Women are dying after childbirth from a brutal infection called childbed fever. But the death rates in the two wards are wildly different. Ward 1, staffed by medical students and doctors who went straight from performing autopsies to delivering babies, had death rates of 10 to 15%. Ward 2, staffed by midwives, sat at around 2%. Women knew. Word got around. Some women were so terrified of Ward 1 that they chose to give birth on the street rather than be admitted there. Semmelweis figured it out. The doctors were carrying something from the dead bodies on their unwashed hands into the delivery room. He introduced a hand-washing protocol using a chlorinated lime solution. Death rates in Ward 1 dropped to roughly 2%. He had essentially discovered that hand-washing saves lives, without knowing what was being transmitted, without germ theory, just from looking at the numbers. And the medical establishment rejected him completely. His evidence was dismissed. His theory was considered implausible. He was eventually committed to a mental institution where he died, from the exact type of infection he'd spent his career trying to prevent. His hand-washing protocol was abandoned after he left. It wasn't until Pasteur and Koch developed germ theory in the following decades that Semmelweis's findings finally made sense to people, and he was only properly recognized as a pioneer about 30 years after his death. The data was clear. The results were undeniable. But without a why that made sense to people, and without doctors being willing to accept that they were accidentally killing their patients, the evidence wasn't enough. That's not just a story about medicine. That's a story about human psychology. So here's the bigger picture, and this is what I really want you to take away from this. Ancient people weren't helpless against disease. They figured out a ton of effective stuff without ever knowing why it worked. Cooking meat thoroughly kills pathogens. Fermenting food creates an acidic environment that stops most bacteria from growing. Quarantine. The word literally comes from Italian quarantino, the 40-day isolation period Venice imposed on ships during the Black Death, worked to slow disease spread without anyone understanding how plague traveled. The hand-washing that happened before meals across cultures, for social decorum, for ritual purity, for religious law, was interrupting the fecal-oral transmission route of cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, and a dozen other major killers. The cultures with the most consistent ritual hand-washing before eating would have had lower rates of those diseases, through a mechanism nobody involved could have named. And here's the part that should really make you think. Today, we know exactly why hand-washing works. We have the science, the infrastructure, the soap, the running water, and yet hand hygiene compliance in hospitals, where people are educated, where the stakes are life and death, where signs are literally everywhere, is often below 60%. Knowing why something works isn't enough to make people actually do it. Ancient people washed their hands for the wrong reasons and got the right results. We know all the right reasons, and we still struggle to do it consistently. Draw your own conclusions from that one.